The fire in the morning room had been lit at 6:30, and by 7, the housekeeper was feeding it letters. Eleanor Vane stood in the doorway with a coal scuttle she had no further use for, and watched 3 years of her own handwriting curl and blacken on the grate. The pages were hers. She knew the slant of every line, the place where the ink had thinned because the pen wanted mending, the small careful hand she had taught herself so that a gentleman might read her quickly and think well of the writer. They went into the flames in fistfuls, and Mrs. Corse did not so much as glance at the words she destroyed. To the house, Eleanor was a maid who had reached above her station, and the burning was a tidiness, a sweeping of the hearth before the family rose. No one in that room imagined that the woman in the doorway had copied every letter she ever sent into a plain, bound book she kept beneath the loose board in the attic. She had begun the copies out of fear, not foresight. A servant who put her name to anything learned to keep a record of what she had said because the great houses had long memories and short mercy, and a girl could be turned out on the strength of a sentence she never wrote. So Eleanor had written everything twice. The letters that left Harrogate Hall in the post, and the letters that stayed, identical, in the book under the board. She had not known, that cold March morning, that the second set would matter. She only knew that the first set was being burned, and that the man who had ordered it burned was standing at the far window with his back to the room, saying nothing at all. Stay with me through this one. By the end you will understand why a maid's plain copybook frightened a duchess more than any fortune could. Now let me take you back to how it began. Eleanor had come to Harrogate Hall at 19, in the 3rd week of a wet autumn, with one box and a character reference written by a vicar who had since died. Her father had been a country attorney of modest practice and high principle, and when he died, he left her his honesty and his debts in roughly equal measure, which is to say he left her nothing she could spend and a great deal she could not put down. She took service because there was no other roof. She swept and carried and learned the back stairs, and at night she read what books the library forgot to lock away, and she taught herself a clean hand, because a clean hand was the one possession no creditor could seize. The hall belonged to the Duke of Ashworth, though in those first years she scarcely saw him. He was abroad, then in town, then shut in the east wing behind doors that opened only for his valet. What ruled the house in his absence was his mother, the Dowager Duchess, a woman of 70, who wore gray silk and carried a fan she never opened, and who had decided long ago precisely what each person beneath her roof was worth. The Dowager passed Eleanor on the stairs one morning in that first winter, looked at her the way one looks at a stain on good cloth, and said to the steward walking beside her, loud enough to carry, that the new girl read too much for a servant, and would come to grief by it. A maid with ideas above the scullery, she said. Mark it. They always go bad. Eleanor marked it. She marked it the way she marked everything, quietly, and went on with the grates. What changed the shape of her years at Harrogate was a child. The Duke had a ward, a small grave boy of 6 named Thomas, the son of a cousin dead in the war. And the boy had been given to the house the way unwanted things are given, with instructions and no warmth. He did not speak. The nurses said he was simple, and washed their hands of the trying. The Dowager said he was an embarrassment, and ought to be sent to the country and forgotten, and the household, taking its temperature from her as a household always does, let the child drift through the long corridors like something the house had not yet decided to keep. He took his meals alone. He was dressed and undressed by a nurse, who spoke over his head as though he were furniture. And he had learned, in the way small creatures learn, that the safest thing in a cold house is to make oneself very small and very quiet, and to want nothing where anyone could see. Eleanor found him one evening on the cold floor of the long gallery, pressed into the corner beneath a portrait of some long-dead lord in armor, his knees drawn up and his face turned to the wall. The candle she carried threw their 2 shadows huge against the paneling. She did not pick him up, or scold him, or tell him children belonged in the nursery, because she remembered being small in a house that had stopped wanting her, and she knew that being seized and corrected was only one more way of being told one was a problem. She set the candle down on the floor. She sat down beside him, in her work apron, on the cold boards, her back against the wainscot, and she began, in an ordinary voice, to tell him the names of the painted lords on the wall. The real names where she knew them, invented ones where she did not, dull, respectable names for the dull, respectable faces, and a ridiculous name for a fat marquess in a yellow coat that made the boy's shoulders move, just slightly, in something that was nearly a laugh. She talked until the candle had burned down a finger's width, and after a long while the boy uncurled enough to put his hand, small and cold, flat against the back of her wrist, and leave it there, the way a person tests whether a fire is real before trusting it with their hands. That was the beginning. She did not move her arm until he was ready to take his hand away. She read to him. That was the act that cost her, though she did not know it would. The boy could not, or would not speak, but he could listen, and she read to him in the hour before the family dined, in a small, unused sitting room where the fire was never lit, both of them wrapped in her one good shawl. She read him histories and travels, and a child's book of fables, and once when she had nothing else, she read him her father's old letters about the law, because the boy liked the steadiness of her voice more than he cared for the words. It was during one of these readings that the Duke first saw her, though she did not know it for months. He had come back to Harrogate quietly, in the winter of her second year, and he kept to the east wing, and the house arranged itself around his silence as around a hole in the floor. Gerald Ashworth was a man of 34, with a face that gave nothing away, dark hair going early to gray at the temples, a jaw held so still it seemed carved from the same cold stone as the house. The servants said he had not laughed since before the war. The dowager said he was in mourning, and that grief was a private matter, and so no one asked, and the great house held its breath around a sorrow it was not permitted to name. He walked the corridors at odd hours when the family was abed, and only the lowest servants were stirring, and one of those hours brought him to the door of the cold sitting room. He stood in the dark of the corridor, where the candle light from the room did not reach him, and he watched. Inside, a maid in a thin shawl sat with the silent boy the whole house had given up on, the two of them wrapped together against the cold, and she was reading to him in a low, steady voice. He could not at first hear the words. He could hear the cadence of them, the patient rise and fall a person uses only when they expect nothing in return. And he watched the boy, his ward, the child he himself had not known how to reach, lean his whole small weight into the side of a servant, and listen with his eyes half closed and his mouth soft. At one turn of the page, the boy lifted his hand and pointed at something, and the maid stopped and answered him as gravely as if he had asked the question aloud, though he had not, though he never did. And the Duke understood that this woman had found a door into the child, that the whole apparatus of the house, its nurses, and its physicians, and its money, had not so much as located. He watched for a long time. Eleanor, intent on the page, and on the warm, small weight of the child against her side, did not look up. The Duke did not enter. He did not speak. He turned and went back the way he had come, his boots silent on the runner, and the next morning a footman delivered a scuttle of coal to the cold sitting room with no explanation, and the fire was lit there every evening after, and no one ever said why. Eleanor thought the housekeeper had relented. She thanked Mrs. Corse, who looked at her strangely, and said she had given no such order, and went away frowning. And the matter was not spoken of again. That was the first of them. The first quiet thing the Duke did, and let her credit to someone else. The letters began that spring. The boy Thomas had an aunt in Bath, his mother's sister, a Mrs. Hartwell, who loved the child and was forbidden by the dowager to visit, the dowager having decided that the connection was beneath the dignity of the house. Eleanor learned of the aunt by accident, from a letter that came and was burned unread on the dowager's order, and something in her would not let it rest. A boy with one person left in the world who wanted him, and the door shut on her by a woman in gray silk who never opened her fan. So Eleanor wrote to Mrs. Hartwell herself in her clean, careful hand, and told her how the boy did, what he ate, that he had pressed his palm to her wrist, that he was not simple but only waiting for the world to be gentle enough to answer. She signed her name. A servant who signs her name to a letter the family would forbid is a servant gambling with her only roof. And Eleanor knew it, and she copied the letter into the book under the board before she sent it, because she was afraid, and because some stubborn lawyer's daughter in her insisted that the truth be kept in two places. For 2 years she wrote to Bath. She wrote of the boy's slow blooming, the first word he spoke, which was her name, the games he learned, the night he laughed. Mrs. Sadder. Hartwell wrote back, and her letters came addressed to Eleanor, and were not burned because no one troubled to burn a servant's post, and between the two women a whole secret country grew up in ink, with the child at the center of it, kept and loved across 40 miles by two people the house had decided did not matter. Eleanor copied every line she sent. The book under the board grew fat. She did not know that the Duke knew. She did not know that his valet, a discreet and elderly man named Pruitt, had told his master of the letters to Bath, nor that the Duke had asked once in a low voice what the maid wrote, and had been told that she wrote the truth about the boy and nothing else. She did not know that her employer had begun to watch for her in the corridors, that the still carved face turned a fraction when she passed, that a man who had not cared for anything in 3 years had started to care whether a particular servant had eaten her dinner. The whole house, had it been watching, might have seen it. Eleanor did not. She read her wound too well to read his face. Her wound was an old and simple one, and it had a sentence attached to it. When she was 18, before her father died, a young man of good family had paid her court through one warm summer, and had told her, when his mother learned of it, that a woman with nothing was a woman a sensible man could not afford. He had said it kindly, which was worse. He had said it as though stating a law of nature. And Eleanor had folded that sentence up small and kept it the way she kept everything, and built her life around the certainty that no one with a choice would ever choose her. So when the Duke of Ashworth began, in his cold, careful way, to alter the weather of the house in her favor, she did not see a man falling in love. She saw a master being kind to a useful servant, and she warned herself not to mistake the one for the other, because she had made that mistake once, and it had cost her a summer and a good deal of her pride. The proximity came whether she invited it or not. The Duke took to visiting the boy in the evenings, and because the boy would not be parted from Eleanor, the three of them sat together in the small room with the fire that no one would admit to lighting. He spoke little. He gave commands that were not quite commands. "Sit," he would say when she rose to leave, meaning stay. "You are cold," he would say, and a heavier shawl would appear the next day. "Eat something," he said one evening, having noticed she had not, and he said it in the flat, hard voice of a man used to being obeyed, and Eleanor heard only the hardness, and obeyed only because he was the Duke. She did not hear beneath the order a man who could not say, "I would not have you go hungry under my roof," and so said the only thing his grief had left him able to say. Once their hands met over the same book, reaching, and she drew hers back as though scalded, and felt her face go hot in the firelight, and she was furious with herself for it, because a flush is a thing a body does when the mind has refused permission. He saw the flush. His jaw moved, the smallest fraction, and he looked back down at the page and read on in his level voice, as though nothing had passed between them. Something had, though. Anyone watching would have seen it. She told herself it was the fire. The Dowager Duchess was not a fool, and a woman who has spent 70 years guarding the worth of a house can smell a threat to it before the threat has a name. She began to watch the cold sitting room. She began to ask the steward who lit the fire there and on whose authority. And one afternoon she summoned Eleanor to the grand drawing room, where she sat among her diamonds with a polished young woman at her side, and delivered the second blow of the dismissive label, this time in company, this time as performance. The young woman was Lady Caroline Frost, the daughter of a marquess, brought to Harrogate as the obvious and correct future duchess, all ice blue silk, and a smile like cut glass. She sat at the dowager's hand with her gloved fingers folded. Just so, a young woman who had been told from the cradle that rooms arranged themselves around her, and who had never once had cause to doubt it. The fire caught the diamonds at her throat, and threw small hard lights across the ceiling. Eleanor, summoned without explanation, stood on the cold edge of the carpet in her gray work dress, her chapped hands folded over her apron, and understood that she had been called here not to be spoken to, but to be displayed. The dowager looked at her the long, deliberate way a buyer looks at a horse she has already decided not to purchase. She turned to Lady Caroline and said, in the carrying voice of one sharing an amusement, that this was the reading maid she had mentioned, the one who fancied herself a governess, and that it was a curious thing what notions a girl could acquire from books she had no business touching. A maid with ideas above the scullery. She said, again the phrase, polished now with 2 years of use, worn smooth as a stone in a pocket. She had taught the girl to read above her place, the dowager said, by leaving the library unlocked, and she did not doubt the next thing would be the girl giving herself the airs of a lady. Lady Caroline laughed, a small silver laugh that cost her nothing, and said it was a wonder the creature had not yet asked to be presented at court. Eleanor stood very still and said nothing. She had learned the discipline of the still face in the first month of service. The way a body holds itself when answering would only invite worse, and she held it now while the 2 women in silk turned her over between them like a thing without ears. The standing still cost her more than any answer would have. She felt the old heat climb her throat, the heat of a person being measured and found wanting in a tongue she was not permitted to speak, and she pressed her chapped hands flat against her apron so they would not shake. The dowager saw the cost. That was the point of the exercise, and the dowager was satisfied, and she dismissed the maid with a flick of the closed fan, the small gesture that in that house meant a person had ceased to be present. What the dowager did not see, because she was a woman who had never in 70 years had cause to look behind her, was that the Duke had come to the drawing-room door midway through her performance. He had heard the whole of it, the reading maid, the airs of a lady, the silver laugh. The carved face, the face the county swore had given nothing away since before the war, had gone for one instant white at the edges of the mouth, a man holding something back at great cost, before it closed again into its usual stone. He did not enter. He did not defend her. Not then, because he was a man who had taught himself that wanting a thing was the surest way to ruin it, and he did not yet trust himself to want this without harm. He turned and went back down the corridor. Eleanor, walking the other way toward the scullery stairs, with her composure held together by will alone, never knew he had been there at all. The wound that made him stone had a name, and the night Eleanor learned it was the night the story turned. The boy Thomas had taken a fever, a sharp, sudden childhood fever that frightened the house, the kind that arrives at evening and by midnight has a small body burning under every blanket the linen press can give. The nurse wrung her hands and was useless. Eleanor sent her to her bed and sat up alone with the child, bathing his forehead with cool water, keeping her voice low and even when he cried out at shapes that were not in the room. And at the deepest hour of the night, the door opened without a knock, and the Duke came in, still dressed, and crossed to the far side of the small bed and sat down. He did not ask how the boy did. He looked at the child's flushed face, and at the basin and the cloth, and he understood without being told that the maid had been there for hours and would not leave. And for once the silence between them was not a wall, but a shared watch. They sat on either side of the bed, through the turn of the fever. Near 3 the heat broke, and the boy's breathing eased, and he slipped down into the deep, clean sleep of a child past the worst. And Eleanor laid the cloth aside and let her shoulders come down from around her ears for the first time in hours. And in the low firelight, watching the child breathe, Gerald Ashworth began to speak of his wife. He did not look at Eleanor while he did it. He looked at the sleeping boy. He had married young, he said, a girl he had loved without measuring, the way one loves before, one has learned what love can cost. She had been delicate. The physicians had warned against a child, had been plain about the danger, and he had wanted one so badly, so selfishly, that he had let himself be persuaded the risk was smaller than it was. She had died bringing his daughter into the world, in a long grey dawn, and the daughter had not lived out the week. He had been in London when it happened, kept by business he had believed urgent, and now could not even recall the substance of. He had not been in the room. He had not held her hand at the end. He had come home to 2 graves in the estate churchyard and a house that smelled of lilies, and he had understood, with a clarity that never afterward left him, that he had loved a person to death by wanting from her the one thing she could not safely give. From his breast pocket he drew a small, worn miniature. An oval no larger than a watch, the painted face of a fair young woman with a quiet mouth and steady eyes. And he held it a moment in the firelight, where Eleanor could see it, and then closed his hand over it, and put it away against his heart, where she understood now. It had been the whole time. "I do not allow myself to want things now," he said, in the flat level voice that the county mistook for coldness. "Wanting is how I do harm." And then he looked, just once, and not for long, at the maid across the sleeping child, and Eleanor understood that he had told her the one thing he had told no one living, and she did not yet understand why a duke would give such a thing to a servant, unless the giving meant more than either of them was permitted to say. I will not pretend this next part was easy to watch. If the boy's slow blooming has touched you, leave a word below for Thomas. Now the door began to close. The dowager moved quickly. Once she moved. She had decided that the maid was the disease, and that Lady Caroline was the cure, and she set about administering it with the cold efficiency of a woman who had managed the marriages of 3 generations. She brought the engagement forward. She let it be known, first as rumor, and then as fact, that the Duke of Ashworth would marry Lady Caroline Frost before the spring was out, and that the match had his mother's full blessing, which in that house had long stood in for his own will. And to clear the ground, she dismissed Eleanor. The dismissal was managed with paper, as the cruelest things often are. A character reference was written, correct and cold, that would let the girl find another place and never set foot in Harrogate again. The boy was to be sent to school, the connection to Bath severed, the cold sitting-room returned to its proper disuse. And because the dowager had at last understood that the maid's letters were the thread tying the child to the forbidden aunt, she ordered them burned. Every letter, Mrs. Hartwell had ever sent, gathered from Eleanor's small room while she was at her work, carried down to the morning room, and fed to the fire on the cold March morning where this story began. The housekeeper burned them in fistfuls. The Duke stood at the window with his back to the room, and the dowager, watching the smoke, believed she had won, because she had destroyed the evidence that a servant had loved a child the family would not, and without evidence she believed there was no story left to tell. She did not know about the book under the board. Eleanor went up to the attic that night by the light of a single candle and lifted the loose board in the corner where the roof came down low, and took out the plain-bound copybook, 3 years thick, every letter she had ever sent written twice in her clean, careful hand. She sat on the cold floor with it in her lap, her back against the chimney breast where a little warmth still came through the brick. And she turned the pages, slowly, and understood at last why some stubborn part of her had insisted on the second copy. Not for her own protection, though, that was the reason she had given herself for 3 years. For the boys. Here in her own writing, dated and ordered page after page, was the whole secret country. The proof that Thomas was not simple. The proof that he had spoken, and that his first word had been a name. The proof that he had laughed on a particular night in a particular month. The proof that an aunt in Bath loved him and had begged for 2 years to be allowed to come and had been refused. The letters the dowager had burned that morning, in fistfuls, were only half of what existed. The other half had been sitting under a board in the attic the entire time, in the one place a duchess would never think to look, because she could not imagine that a maid's hand was worth keeping, could not conceive that anything a servant wrote might one day weigh more than anything she herself had ever decreed. The candle guttered. Eleanor closed the book and held it against her chest in the cold. And the dark moment came, and it was not the loss of her place. She had lost places before, and survived. The dark moment was the choice the book put into her hands. She could go quietly with her cold, correct reference folded in her box, and find another roof in another county, and keep her head down, as she had been told to do since she was 19, and let the boy go to his school and the aunt to her grief and the duke to his ice-blue marriage, and no one would ever blame her, because no one expected a servant to do anything else. Or she could do the one thing her father's daughter had been raised to believe in and had never once dared, which was to lay the truth on the table in front of the very people who had decided it did not exist, and to do it knowing that they could break her for it. She thought of the young man who had told her kindly, in a garden one summer, that a woman with nothing was a woman a sensible man could not afford. She thought of the Duke's flat voice in the sick room, saying that wanting was how he did harm. She thought of the boy's hand, small and cold, flat against the back of her wrist on the gallery floor, the first time anyone in that house had reached for her without wanting something from her in return. The candle burned lower, and she made her choice in the cold attic with the book held to her chest. And it was not a choice for herself at all, and that was precisely what gave her the courage to make it. A woman who acts to save her own pride can be talked out of it. A woman who acts to save a child cannot. The engagement was to be announced at a dinner. 30 at the long table the county invited, the dowager in her best diamonds, Lady Caroline in ice blue at the Duke's right hand, the whole machinery of the house assembled to make official what one woman in gray silk had decided. Eleanor was meant to be gone by then. She was not gone. She had stayed in the servants' quarters on the strength of a kindness from Mrs. Corse, who had burned the letters on order and had not been able to meet the girl's eyes since, and who, when Eleanor asked one thing of her, looked at her for a long moment and then said she would see the book carried to the right hands. The right hands belonged to the family solicitor, an old precise man named Mr. Brandt, who had served the late Duke and had never cared for the dowager, and who had been quietly appalled for years at the treatment of the boy. The dinner reached its sweet course. The dowager rose, fan in hand, to make her announcement, and the doors at the end of the long room opened, and the old solicitor came in with a plain-bound book in his hands, and behind him, in a borrowed gray gown that was clean and plain among all that silk, came the maid. The house had burned the letters of walking, the length of the room she had only ever entered to carry coal. The dowager's voice stopped. The whole table turned. Lady Caroline's silver smile went uncertain. And into that silence the solicitor laid the copybook open on the white cloth before the Duke, and said in his dry, precise voice that there was a matter touching the ward of the house that ought to be heard before any announcement was made. He read 3 lines. He read the boy's first word, which was a name. He read the night the child laughed. He read the aunt in Bath who had begged for 2 years to be allowed to love what the family had thrown away. And the room, which had assembled to celebrate a marriage, sat in the cold understanding that a child had been kept alive in ink by a servant while the house looked the other way. The dowager found her voice. She said the word she had always said, the dismissive label for the third and last time, and now it came out brittle, in front of 30 witnesses, stripped of its old polish. A maid, she said. A maid with ideas above her station going through gentlemen's private affairs, and the girl ought to be given to the magistrate, not heard at a dinner table. She looked to her son to confirm it, as he had always confirmed it, with silence. The Duke stood. He did not look at his mother. He crossed the length of the long room, past the diamonds and the ice-blue silk and the 30 turned faces, and he stopped in front of Eleanor Vane, who stood very still, with her chapped hands folded as she had stood in the drawing-room, while they laughed at her. He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, and then, in the flat, level voice that the whole county knew gave nothing away, he said the thing he had not allowed himself to want for 3 years, Miss Vane will be staying. As my wife. The silence after was a held thing. A room of 30 people not breathing. The dowager's fan, the fan she never opened, dropped from her hand to the table. Lady Caroline set down her glass with a small click and looked, for the first time all evening, like a young woman who had been brought to a place under false understanding, and now saw it plain. And the old solicitor closed the copybook gently, as one closes a thing that has done its work, and said that the ward of the house would not be going to any school, that the aunt in Bath would be written to in the morning, and that he would draw up the settlements himself. Gerald did not gloat, and he did not explain, and he did not deliver a speech. He took Eleanor's folded hands in his, and opened them, and held them, the chapped hands the house had taught her to be ashamed of, and he held them in front of everyone as though they were the only valuable thing in the room. "I was not in the room once when it mattered," he said low, for her and not for the table. "I am in the room now." The dowager rose, gray and shaken, and for a moment the old order gathered itself to strike. The table had heard the letters, though the county had heard them. And a duchess who has been confidently wrong in front of 30 people discovers that her authority was always only their belief in her, and that belief had just changed hands. She sat back down. She did not speak again that night. They were married quietly in the spring, in the small church on the estate, with the boy Thomas standing between them holding the ring on a cushion, having insisted, in the full clear speech he now used freely, that the ring was his particular charge. Mrs. Hartwell came from Bath, and wept, and was given the seat of honor. The dowager attended, in gray, displaced from the center of a house she had ruled for 40 years, corrected rather than destroyed, and in the months after she softened by slow degrees toward the child. She had once called an embarrassment, as the confidently wrong sometimes do when the world declines to end at their displacement. The copybook was not burned. Eleanor kept it, 3 years, of her clean, careful hand, on the shelf in the small sitting room, where the fire was now always lit, where she still read to the boy in the hour before dinner, though her husband sat with them now and no longer pretended he had not ordered the coal. On a winter evening, near the close of that first married year, with snow coming down past the windows and the fire steady in the grate, Thomas asked her to read again the letter about the night he had first laughed, and she took the worn book down and found the page and read it aloud in the warm room while the snow. The truth, she had kept in 2 places now, needing only one. Gerald watched her read, the miniature still in his breast pocket, the old grief carried but no longer ruling. And the boy's hand lay flat against the back of her wrist, as it had the first evening on the cold gallery floor, when the only warmth in the great house had been the 2 of them in a corner beneath the painted lords. The letters they burned were ash by then, and had been for a year. The ones she had kept were warm in her lap, and would stay. If Eleanor's quiet courage stayed with you, I am glad you sat with it to the end.